Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us today with ICNA Council for Social Justice. My name is Thoraya Hussein, and here I have Iman here with me, and I have Sister Salma Abu Juderi. She's a counselor and a therapist who specifies in marriage counseling, and I have Sister Zahra, who work with the county, Fairfax County, and also both Sister Salma and Sister Zahra, both of them are working in an organization called Peaceful Families Project, specifying helping people who went through domestic violence. So today we're gonna talk about domestic violence and the impact in our community. So, Sister Salma, assalamu alaikum. The first question is gonna be to you, actually. So what is domestic violence or domestic abuse?
Yeah, so domestic violence refers to any kind of relationship where there's one person in that relationship that's trying to control another person. And the person who's trying to control would use any number of sort of behaviors to try to get that control to happen. So it could be threatening, it could be name calling, it could be hitting, it could be isolating or manipulating. Any type of methodology could be used, but the goal is basically, if I were the abusive person, that I want you to do whatever I say. And I will do whatever it takes to get you to do what I say. So, that's basically, and from an Islamic perspective, we think of this as a kind of oppression. It's a dhulm. And then, domestic violence can be towards any person who has less power. So it could be between spouses, it could be between parent and child, it could be sometimes it's an adult child who's abusive towards an elderly person. So it can be pretty wide range in terms of what kind of relationships.
Yeah. Okay.
So what are the different types of domestic abuse?
So you mean like in terms of verbal,
Yes.
and financial, and
Yeah.
sexual abuse? So again, I mean, abuse could happen in so many different ways, but we often categorize it in terms of verbal abuse, which would be name calling or insults, psychological abuse, which would be like threats and intimidation, but
Right.
even could be like, making jokes that are really offensive.
Yeah.
That could be a kind of psychological abuse. I mentioned isolation, which is a form of psychological abuse. You sometimes will see financial abuse, so
Right.
like preventing access to finances. Could be even sometimes we see people who earn their own income, could be an attorney or a physician, and she's earning but has no access to her own income. So that's like a kind of financial abuse. And sexual abuse, so any kind of forced or unwanted sexual activity, even between spouses.
Husband and wife, yeah.
Yep, even between husband and wife. We would call that sexual abuse. And then there is spiritual abuse, which is spiritual or religious abuse, which is misusing a religious teaching, like a hadith or an ayah, to basically manipulate someone
Manipulation,
to do
yeah, that's
what you
something I
want.
was gonna.
Yeah.
And I think there's something important to note that the types of abuse, it's usually a pattern of coercive behavior, and it's over time, right? So it's not like one day someone did this and that action turns into abuse. It's more of like over time, and when there's a clear power and control dynamic between whatever the partners are. Again, like Sister Salma said, that it can look very differently in different families, and especially like nowadays there's a lot of things that we have to think about as well, especially with the types of abuse, because there are a lot of undocumented immigrants in the county, in our county, and all throughout the United States, and a lot of times legal status is a type of abuse that perpetrators
Can be held over someone, yeah.
Question number 3.
Which one are we at? Number 2?
Number 3.
So, what are the effects on mental health when people don't seek help? So, the effects on the mental health of the person who's getting abused.
Sure. So, I mean, if somebody's in an abusive relationship, of course, each of us could respond really differently. But oftentimes we see people, especially, like as Zahra mentioned, this is something that happens over time. So when you're in a relationship where repeatedly you're being insulted, let's say, verbally abused or threatened, or hit, then eventually, you start to develop this kind of anxiety, because it can often feel very unpredictable, and it can often feel like no matter what I do, I'm going to get in trouble, something's going to happen. So anxiety is very common. People can start to feel depressed. People often feel stuck. So if they've been isolated, especially, and deprived financially, they can feel really stuck in this relationship, and so depression is not uncommon. And if the abuse is severe and chronic, I mean, sometimes people can develop post-traumatic stress disorder from living in an abusive relationship. So it can have pretty significant effects. And on children, people often think that children are not really going to be impacted if they're not the ones being abused. But when they're growing up in that type of household, they also can develop all kinds of behavioral issues as well as the same kind of mental health issues. So it has a big effect.
Actually, you just pointed in a very important point we always argue about, the effect of children. Because in our community, if you talk to a person who's been abused, they're always going to say, oh, I'm sacrificing because of my children. So they think staying in that relationship, actually, they're benefiting your children. So I want you to clarify this, actually, because what I say to people, actually, you should get out of this relationship because of your children. So
yeah, it's so complicated, and when I'm finished, I want you to say something, because you worked with youth. But it's really complicated. I think it's easy for us from the outside to say you should get out or you should stay. The truth is that every situation has to be evaluated. But there is no doubt at all. I mean, there's plenty of research that tells us that children who grow up in these environments are very much at risk of behavioral problems, so like getting into gangs or committing crimes or taking drugs. They want to escape that environment in any way, and if they don't go in that behavioral, negative acting out kind of behavior, they still are taking all of this in, and they're learning it, right? And so they're learning a very unhealthy way of living in a relationship. So it can have really long-term effects. And people do think that it's better for the kids to have two parents. But it's only better if those two parents are behaving themselves.
Yes,
right?
so they have a healthy relationship.
Yeah, but I'm sure you've seen the effects on the youth that you've taught.
And again, it's because it's such a gray area, and it's so hard to be like, this is what's right for every single relationship, this is what's right for every single child, because every single child also manifests trauma in different ways. And it's actually scientifically proven that a baby also physically holds trauma within themselves, and so that trauma manifests differently, especially with tying in mental health. I think mental health is a public health issue, and it's not put into medicine enough, because a lot of times the trauma you don't see physically, or you don't see mentally, and you don't see emotionally, but it does manifest into people's bodies in different ways. And especially when I worked with kids and especially adolescents, that's when you kind of see those things coming out from your adolescence to, I would say, your late 20s. It starts coming out at that time. So again, a lot of kids are either hyperactive, or they say that they have ADHD, or they're diagnosed with different things. Not saying that those things don't exist, but there's usually an underlying issue that hasn't been addressed. And even speaking of kids, where because I mostly worked with adolescent boys, so I can speak on their behalf, where a lot of times being a teenager is hard in general, but I think when you go into that trauma mode, a lot of it comes out in aggression. And so a lot of times they don't know how to use that aggression constructively, and so their acting out or they're not listening is usually a cry for help. And it's usually whenever I looked at those kids, there's usually something wrong in their families. They didn't see healthy relationships, so they didn't know how to manifest that into their own relationships, be it friendships, be it a teacher-student relationship, be it if they're exploring their romantic relationships, they don't know how to handle that. And so I think that's really important to know, I think for everybody. If you see that, don't always label a kid as bad. That's my very big soapbox. No kids are bad. Exactly. There's usually something else that's going on. Yeah.
So the other question is really important. What does Islam say about domestic abuse.
So, I mean, Islam, the word Islam itself comes from the Arabic word which means peace, right? So anything that's counter to peace cannot be Islamic. And if we're talking about people feeling afraid in their own homes and people who are, you know, like feeling unsafe and people who are getting hurt physically or emotionally hurt, that it just can't fit, right? And so if one person is trying to control another, you know, that's a kind of domination that, I mean, it's oppression, right? So it is dhulm, and I think every Muslim knows, we all know that that's not okay.
Yeah.
Even though people may try to justify it, like people will say, well, my wife isn't behaving right, and so I just have to protect her from the hellfire, so, you know, I need to discipline her. But, you know, when we look at the model of the Prophet ﷺ, how he corrected people's behaviors, I mean, that was his job, right? To correct people's behavior and give them the message. And he never did raise his voice. He didn't hit anybody. He didn't threaten anyone. He never put people down, or he didn't even judge, you know, like make people feel bad about their, wherever their state of, you know, practice of their religion was. So, you know, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's an excuse, and it's another, you know, just sort of manipulative tactic. But we don't have anything in our deen, in our religion, that encourages or allows us to take a violent or an oppressive stance with another human being.
So can you take a second or maybe a minute to talk about maybe the ayah that men could use to justify their actions? And I think you know what ayah.
You're referring to verse 434?
Yes.
And you want me to talk about it in a minute?
So
This is a verse, of course, that, you know, what's been fascinating to me is in my work, whether with Muslims or non-Muslims, everyone knows about this verse, which is 434 from Surah An-Nisa. And, you know, the Quran is something that we have to look at as a whole. And the first verse in the same surah, in the same chapter, 4:1, actually kind of frames how we're supposed to view each other. And it talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating us from a single soul. And from that soul created its mate. And he talks about the importance of, you know, family relationships and the reverence for the wombs that bore us, so our mothers, right? And so that should take away any interpretation of any other verse, you know, misinterpretation that would suggest that there's a place for men to abuse women. So, but if we look at 434, because I think we have to, you know, be comfortable with, you know, every verse, the verse is actually setting up the, you know, gender relationships. And it starts out with the qawama, the responsibility that men have to take care of women and to protect them and keep them safe, right? Not to hurt them and beat them up, right? And to financially provide for them. And it outlines the, you know, a righteous woman is one who protects and preserves sort of the privacy of the home, right? And then in a very exceptional case where there's nushuz, and people have to understand, like, the application of the steps that follow are for a very specific case, right? So nushuz is, you know, and some kind of a behavior that's threatening the integrity of the marriage, okay? So it could be like maybe flirtatious behavior or bringing, you know, men into the home that it's destructive to the relationship, right? So if there is that situation, then we can look at the steps that follow. But the people who are abusive use this verse as an excuse for their behavior, and they're not necessarily dealing with a situation of nushuz. It could be just like, I really don't want you to go to the grocery store right now. If you go, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. You know, I don't want you to visit your mother, so if you go, I'm gonna you know, tell your parents that you're a bad wife or whatever. So we're not dealing with nushuz. So it's a rare situation, a specific situation, and there are some steps, and those steps have to be followed in order. There's a process that includes first, you know, trying to remedy the situation by talking, you know, and that talking could include counseling and separating in bed, so suspending intimacy. And the final step is daraba wadribuhunna, which has been interpreted in a range of ways, including literally like hitting or separating from your wife.
Yes.
And in even the scholars that say that it's a literal kind of hitting, they say that it's not to be and leave a mark or to cause any injury. It's more to just like a symbolic to sort of say, hey, we have a serious problem here. But there's no scholar that says that it's okay to just, you're upset with your wife this morning, so let me give her a couple of slaps. And, so it's really important that we take this verse in the context of, one, the rest of the Quran, and then that we look at the tafsir, the living tafsir, which is the Prophet ﷺ, and how he dealt with conflict in his marriage and difficulties in his marriage, and he did not resort to hitting anybody. Actually, Aisha radiallahu anha said that he never hit a woman or a child. So we have to take all of that. And I know I exceeded my 1 minute, but it's not possible.
Yes,
It's an important, we need to talk about.
So this form of spiritual, religious abuse and other forms of abuse are really big in our communities, and there's the whole cultural stigma of us not talking about it. So knowing someone that is dealing with abuse or being abused, how would you help them, or how would you support them?
I mean, I think there's so many ways, and I'm sure you have some ideas about this as well. So I mean, I think the first thing is we have to recognize when something is abusive. We just have to recognize it, and we have to be willing to call it what it is. And if somebody's talking to us about their situation, we really just should listen and not judge them and believe them. Because, theoretically, we would say, we would believe them. But when somebody's telling us about a person that we know, it's really actually hard to believe. We don't want to believe that somebody could be that ugly or that evil, right? So we need to believe that this is, and then we really need to give space for that person to figure out what he or she wants to do. And it's most often women who are abused, but men could be abused as well. But we want to give them space and provide, resources. But the first step, the hardest step is often for someone just to say, I'm experiencing this in my relationship, because there is so much stigma, right? And people feel ashamed, even though it's never the victim's fault, but still people feel ashamed and they feel embarrassed. So they often struggle to talk about it. So I'm sure you have some other thoughts.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to the intention of I think the person providing support, because that's all you're providing, right? You're not their savior. You're not solving the problem. I think it's very easy to get into that mindset that especially when you're passionate about something, it's very easy to be I'm going to go and save everybody who's suffering from domestic violence. But I think what's really important to know is that it's the empowerment of the survivor that you need to worry about. And when someone's already in a state of being controlled, they don't need another third party to be controlling them and telling them what to do. Because a lot of times you have to take it case by case and family by family. Sometimes leaving is more harmful to the survivor than actually staying in the relationship. And I know in my own work, we do safety planning in terms of if you're going to stay in the house, what does that look like? What does that look like for your children? What does that look like for yourself? If there is a case where things you are going to escalate and you see them escalating, what would you do in that situation? But I think people need community, right? And people need support, and people need to know that they're believed. So I think the first step, if somebody does disclose something to you, believe them. I think that's the trouble that I'm not even going to say only the Muslim community, but societal. Because I think it's very careful, human nature is human nature. And so we can say that this community is struggling with this community is struggling with this, but even if a non-Muslim came and told you something, I think you should react the same way that you would with a Muslim brother or sister. So for me, it's believe them, because we always ask, well, why don't you just leave? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you? You should have known when you got into the relationship before. And I'm if she had started seeing or talking to someone, or he had started seeing or talking to someone, and they slapped them on the first meeting, of course they wouldn't end up in the relationship. And I think that's kind of the power and control that there's a lack of understanding that this builds over time. And the person if they want to build control, they strategically build that control.
Yes.
It doesn't happen overnight, and the person, if that doesn't happen overnight, the victim or survivor definitely doesn't know that it's happening until like there's certain point where they're just like, I can't take it, and that's when they would come to someone. So obviously there's no like straight answer, which is frustrating for a lot of people, but I think keeping in mind that like supporting and meeting the person where they are is important, and that looks very differently with different people.
And you think, you mentioned the support and the safety planning and things you do. If you can just briefly talk about like the support, like the website or the phone number, or like what is the people if they really need that help, and that's safe, it could be disclosed, doesn't mean that's going to be a legal issue.
Right.
If you can,
So with Peaceful Families Project does the prevention and education. So I think first of all, before the safety planning of the actual issue, I think masjids and community places need to be open to providing that education and prevention, because no one's going to access resources if they don't know what's offered. And so I think that's the starting point, because a lot of people want to intervene when there's a crisis, but nobody wants to prevent it.
Okay.
And I think that's really, really important to have that established beforehand. And that starts from childhood. I always think everything starts from childhood, because if kids don't know that, if we don't teach that in Sunday school, like they're not going to know when they're growing up, and the same little boys are going to turn into, I hope not, but like at the same time, like it's a fact, it's a cycle of abuse. If they see that their dad hits their mom, they're going to think that's normal behavior. And same thing with women, if they're the victims, then they're going to think that's normal behavior, that like, men are allowed to hit women. So that's the first point. But if there is someone who is seeking services, and I'll speak for about Fairfax County since that's where most of us reside, the hotline number, it's 703-360-7273. That provides 24/7 crisis intervention. So even if you didn't know what the resources are, if you call that number, all the resources will be given to you. And it's confidential, and so none of your information is going to go anywhere. And even if you gave them your name or their zip code or anything, they're not going to disclose that to anyone. And so I think like that's the first point of contact if you should find referrals and everything like that. But the county, like if you live in the county, use the county resources. You pay tax money, like you should use the resources. And there's so much, probably more than I know. So once you get your foot in the door, then there's like a variety of things that you can get.
So what would be the different legal support that someone can get if they're being abused?
Well, I don't think either of us are lawyers, but in terms of like legal services, again, it's case by case, right? So if a person is in a domestic violence situation, there's an incident, they call the police, right? That turns into a criminal case depending on what the situation is, right? So usually what the standard thing is that a police officer usually issues an emergency protective order that lasts for a limited amount of time, and what the victim survivor needs to do is they need to go to court and basically plead their case and everything, and they can extend that protective order. And what a protective order, it's a restraining order that you can't come in contact, and depending on the situation, there's different things that are written in a protective order that speak to the victim situation. So like, it can include the kids if there are kids. It can include pets. People forget about pets, but a lot of times even abusers use pets to abuse the victim. If they have a cat or dog and they don't feed the cat or dog, or they're like kicking the cat or dog, like that's a thing too. So that would be like the legal services right then and there. In terms of like furthering, there's Legal Services of Northern Virginia, which provide referrals, they provide advocacy. There's a bunch of things that they provide, and I can't speak on behalf of that because I don't work there, but that's a resource that if someone did need that, the advocates in court would kind of walk them through that process. So I think advocates are really good in terms of, and they're court advocates, there are domestic violence, sexual violence advocates that work in specific areas. And so an advocate's job is to advocate.
Yeah.
And that looks very differently for everyone. So if legal services were needed for a victim, they would work through their like process.
Yeah, but
And-
once the person call that number, there is that resources being connected,
Yeah.
and legal sometimes is not as intense as like calling the police officer. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
as simple as the lady wanted to get divorced,
Right, right.
and she needed help, like a lawyer, how to
Right.
finalize that divorce and how to. So
Exactly.
just our understanding is to call that number, and
Right.
then people can be just guided to
Yeah.
different
Yeah. Yeah.
department according to cater to their needs.
Right. And like to just say very like this is very minimal, very simple, but like
Mhm.
hitting someone is assault.
Mhm.
That is a criminal offense. And I think
Mhm.
people forget that even in a marriage, it's still assault.
It is
It's still a
assault.
criminal offense. And so, think before you act.
Yes.
At the end
Yes.
of the day, you wouldn't hit
Indeed.
someone on the street, so why do you hit someone at home?
Exactly.
That's simple.
Exactly.
And by
Yeah,
the same
so sad.
token, like I think in our community sometimes we have like a negative response when somebody does call the police, like in a
Mhm.
report. And so, like what you just said, so if I were assaulted on the street,
I would
nobody
call.
nobody would think twice
Yes,
if
to
I
call.
called the police. Nobody would
Right.
would
Mhm.
criticize me for
Of
calling the
course.
police,
Absolutely.
right? And so,
Absolutely, yeah.
if I'm being assaulted at home,
Mhm.
it's the same thing. I mean, I
Yes.
should get that kind of assistance, and we have to, as a community, support people and encourage them to take those actions
Yeah.
instead of
Shaming them.
them.
Yes.
Or even saying
absolutely.
like pray
Yeah.
about it, or like
Mhm.
God's testing a
Oh, yeah.
relationship,
Yeah.
and like
testing you.
that doesn't really help someone in a
Mm.
situation. Even if it's true, you don't know, you're not God,
Yes.
so you
Yeah.
can't really
Exactly.
speak on behalf of God.
It's right.
So like you can only do and like act on your behalf.
Yes.
And you can pray and call the police.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
right?
That's very
right?
true.
You say
Yeah.
Bismillah and you call the
Yeah.
police.
Yeah.
That's what you
Yeah.
gotta
That's
do.
true.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, how do you encourage someone to get help? Someone who's in this situation and just refusing to get help, or just in denial of their own abuse, or anything
Or
like
scared because of the stigma of society.
Mhm.
Um,
So I think again, like Zahra was saying, there's no formula for this.
Mhm.
Every situation is different, but I think what is really important is to remember what our role is, and that it's not my job to save you. It's
Mhm.
my job to be the best support that I can
Yes.
be.
Mhm.
And that might look like just listening.
Mhm.
It might look like giving you a
Encouragement.
brochure or a
Yes.
phone number. It may be encouragement. It might be showing you ayahs or hadith that say that you shouldn't be treated this way.
Mhm.
Or, helping you to interpret, not to interpret, but to read the ayahs and the hadith in a way that's different from the misinterpretation, right? So when a hadith is used against a person, that, for example, we should cover the flaws of our fellow
Mhm.
believer, which is absolutely what we should be
Yeah.
doing. And when it comes to dhulm and oppression, we have a different teaching,
Mhm.
which is we have to speak up about it. We have to change it. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Ansur akhaka zaliman aw mazluman," you have to help your fellow Muslim, whether the oppressed or the oppressor.
Mhm.
And the companion said, "But how do we help the oppressor?" And he said, "Stop that person from oppressing." So
Exactly. Yes.
we have these teachings that we have to lift up.
Mhm.
And I think that oftentimes those teachings, as well as helping people understand the damage to their children that's happening,
Mhm.
can often help people take that very scary step
Yeah.
of seeking help. But we also have to realize that when people seek help, they do get backlash from the community.
Of course.
And
Yes.
so
Indeed.
we may have to do not just directly with the person who's
Mhm.
being abused, but we may need to do some work in the community to
Yeah.
make it a safer place,
Yeah.
because it's really hard to get help and risk losing your family or losing your community
Yeah.
or being shamed in the
Mhm.
community. So
Mhm.
I think we all have a lot of work
Mhm.
to do, and it might not be just focusing on getting the victim to get help. It might be
Yeah.
that we have to create that culture in the community.
You just mentioned the culture, and connected to that, a lot of time often people misinterpret culture to religion. Like they talk about the cultural background
Mhm.
as it is a religion. So I just want you to a little bit clarify, people to just shed a light on that. Like there is something called culture, which has
Mhm.
nothing to do with religion, and there is religion. So If you
Yeah,
could-
I mean, so that's a big question, of course. All of us have probably multiple identities, right? And so as Muslims, when we want to know what does our religion say, we go to our sources, right? The Quran and the Sunnah. And if there is some practice that is in our family, and maybe it's normal in our family, but it violates the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, then that's a cultural practice.
Yeah.
And, Islam didn't ban culture. On the contrary, Islam really, like, if we think about, like, the early Muslims, they already had a culture, right, before Islam came. And basically anything that didn't contradict Islam, they kept it.
Yes.
Which is why, we can all dress differently within the bound of modesty. We can have different marriage, celebrations that look differently, because as long as it's, not violating a specific teaching, then there's a lot of room for culture. But as soon as it's violating, then we have to be willing to say, okay, this cultural practice is violating the higher, like religious teaching, then we need to, like, toss it out.
Yeah.
And that's
that-
hard.
Yeah, and that requires self-reflection.
Yeah.
I think people don't self-reflect enough, and so when you're even acting out on something, or I know a lot of times I heard growing up that, like, well, your religion does say this, or, like, an uncle will be like, well, this is in Islam, but it's not really.
Yeah.
So I think it's okay if, like, you get them confused, but I think being aware that you are getting confused is a step to correct it, right? So if there is a cultural practice and it's not, like, Islamically, it's not, like, not allowed, but it's not part of Islam.
Yeah.
Like, it's still okay to do that. Like, we all, like, even on this table, like, we're all different cultures, but we're still Muslim, and I feel like when people start to recognize that, it's actually easier to make the distinction.
Yeah.
And being okay with that there's two sides, and you can live with both of them in harmony, just don't, like, muddle them together.
Yeah, to conclude, like, إنما بعثت لأتمم مكارم الأخلاق. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, I came to complete the manners, so, and he said whatever a cultural thing that's, like, goes with not harming, human being community, it's okay with Islam.
Right.
If it's harmful, like Sister Salma said, it's
Yeah.
that means it's contradict the higher,
Mm-hmm.
and then just stop it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for joining us today. I feel like with all your answers, I think we hit like a lot of major points and a lot of major discussion things that we always hear in the community, and I feel like your answers were very well thought out and were really good, mashallah. So I hope we answered a lot of questions for the community, and hopefully someone gets help, or if, like, finds this video beneficial at all. So
And they also can always reach us here at ICNA or reach Peaceful Families Project, and inshallah we can help the step before going to, call the hotline.
Inshallah.
Thank you everybody for
Inshallah.
being
Thank
here,
you.
and
for hosting us.
thank you.
Thank you.